For decades, Carl Jung circled a specific, deeply unsettling premise. To him, Jesus of Nazareth was a psychological event. In his private writings, Jung argued that Jesus was the first human being in recorded history to fully complete a clinical process he called individuation. For 2 millennia, institutions have built layers of theology, doctrine, and moral codes on top of the Gospels. This framework treats the events of his life as rigid religious instruction, effectively burying the raw, terrifying psychological reality of what actually happened. Jung proposed a completely different lens. He stripped away the Church's doctrine and looked at the timeline of Jesus' life as a clinical map. Step by step, it reads as a precise series of experiential instructions for dismantling the false self and becoming a fully integrated human being. Read this way, the familiar passages of Sunday school transform. They become a detailed architecture for the deepest, most agonizing psychological transformation a human mind can undergo. To read this map, you have to understand the terrain. In Jung's framework, the human psyche is a battlefield. On one side is the ego, the conscious, socially acceptable version of you that performs a carefully curated identity. On the other side is the unconscious, a vast, incomprehensible expanse holding everything the conscious mind rejects. Jung called this rejected material the shadow. It consists of parts of yourself that society or family deemed unacceptable. Your rage, grief, raw ambition, and spiritual hunger are buried down here, constantly pulling at the clean edges of the ego. Individuation is the refusal to keep running. It is the terrifying process of descending into the unconscious to meet the shadow face to face, integrating those rejected pieces into a structurally sound whole. This theory emerged from intense personal trauma. Between 1913 and 1917, Jung nearly lost his mind. He underwent this descent himself, documenting a period of extreme psychological disintegration where he had to claw his way through his own abyss. When he finally emerged and stabilized, he looked at the historical timeline of Jesus. Jung realized the exact terrifying descent he had barely survived in private was perfectly mirrored in public, historical events, lived out in front of witnesses. The psychological journey begins at the Jordan River. In the oldest accounts of the baptism, the heavens are violently torn apart. Jung read this as an encounter with the numinous, a massive, overwhelming eruption of the unconscious, seizing the ego with such force it can only be described using the language of the divine. Immediately after this seizure, the spirit drives him into the desert. He is not invited, he is compelled. This extreme isolation, forced upon the individual without their consent, is a deeply familiar feeling to anyone who has actively begun the individuation process. The psyche drags you where you do not want to go. Those 40 days of fasting and temptation serve as a clinical shadow confrontation. The adversary in this text, Satan or the Diabolos, represents the repressed, rejected, dark aspect of the divine itself. Look closely at the specific temptations offered in the wasteland. Bread, the desperation for physical survival. Power, the fantasy of total control. And testing God, craving absolute certainty. The response to these urges is the critical detail. Jesus does not close his eyes and pretend they don't exist. He enters into a direct dialogue with his shadow. He faces each temptation consciously, acknowledges it, and chooses differently. This distinction defines Jungian psychology. Simply suppressing our darkest urges creates neurosis, forcing the shadow to act out in destructive ways. Consciously confronting and refusing those urges is the exact mechanism that drives psychological transformation. Surviving the shadow confrontation produces a specific behavioral outcome: radical unconditioning. A person operating from a newly integrated self no longer calculates their behavior based on social validation or the desperate need for approval. You see this clearly in the public ministry. He touches lepers, speaks to women in public, and dines with tax collectors. He approaches people society designated as untouchable. A man who has integrated his shadow no longer projects his internal darkness onto societal outcasts or enemies. The teaching that the kingdom of heaven is within you operates as a first-century rabbi's description of this newly integrated state of consciousness. It describes a psychological reality available in the present moment, independent of an afterlife destination. The absolute climax of this psychological journey takes place in the Garden of Gethsemane. Faced with his impending execution, the terror is so extreme it causes a documented physiological breakdown, forcing blood to seep through his sweat glands. Here, the internal war is laid bare. The ego pleads desperately for physical survival, begging, "Take this cup from me." But that desperate instinct clashes violently against the deeper, unified center, which answers, "Yet not my will, but yours be done." Jung viewed Gethsemane as the ultimate pivot point of human development. It is the exact moment a human being, completely aware of the excruciating terror ahead, voluntarily chooses the path of psychological wholeness over the familiar path of comfort and survival. The crucifixion functions psychologically as the public, absolute death of the ego structure. It is the total dismantling of the internal voice that says, "I am separate, I am defended, and I am in control." The most vital moment of this process is the cry of dereliction from the cross. My God, why have you forsaken me?" This marks the point of absolute psychological nakedness. Every piece of internal certainty, every divine comfort, and every external support structure completely collapses. This terrifying void of certainty perfectly aligns with the clinical concept of the dark night of the soul, a term Jung borrowed from St. John of the Cross. It represents the mandatory darkness that exists between the final death of the ego and the eventual rebirth of the self. Screaming into this void is not a failure of faith. Refusing to spiritually bypass the pain with theology or doctrine is the ultimate act of being fully human, entirely present, and completely honest in the worst possible moment. When the ego truly surrenders its grip and dies, something new emerges. Jung identified this as the self, represented in the text by the resurrected Christ. This new entity is highly relational, walks through the world completely unarmored, and is no longer limited by the heavy constrictions of the ego. Jung saw the ascension, the withdrawal of the physical man, as the point where the specific historical life transitioned into a universal psychic structure. By leaving the physical world, the Christ image became an archetype, a permanent pattern etched into the human unconscious that anyone in any era can encounter in the depths of a crisis. Jung spent his career issuing a very specific warning. The most dangerous thing a human being can do is to live an unlived life. It is entirely possible to spend 80 years merely managing a defended ego, performing a safe identity, and entirely avoiding the descent into your own depths. This leaves you with a 2,000-year-old psychological map. The question is, where are you on it? Are you currently negotiating with your shadow in the desert? Are you sweating through the night in the garden, hoping someone will rescue you? Or are you standing in the rubble of your crucified ego, waiting to see what comes next?